The shaking stopped. The ground went still. For a brief moment, it felt like survival. Buildings that were still standing groaned softly. Dust settled into the streets. People stepped outside, blinking, trying to understand what had just passed. They thought the danger was over. Then the city began to burn. Flames appeared in one place, then another, then everywhere at once. Not explosions, not chaos, just fire. Fire climbing walls, fire spilling out of windows, fire racing through narrow streets faster than people could run. The wind picked up, hot, dry, relentless. It carried sparks across rooftops, pulled burning air into alleys, turned small fires into something much larger. People ran, not away from collapsing buildings, but away from heat so intense it stole their breath. They ran through streets that no longer led anywhere, between walls of flame that closed in behind them, past neighborhoods that vanished in minutes. The sky darkened, not with night, but with smoke and ash. Burning debris fell like snow. Some tried to outrun it, some tried to hide from it. Some stood frozen, unable to understand how the city could change so completely, so fast. There were no sirens guiding them, no safe routes marked on the streets, no clear place to go when everything around them was on fire. Only heat, wind, and a city turning into an inferno. This wasn't the aftermath. This was the real disaster, because the ground had already stopped moving. And yet, this was the moment Tokyo began to die. So the question isn't what caused the shaking. The real question is, why did the worst part come after the ground went still? It happened in the middle of the day, not at night, not while the city slept. At noon, when Tokyo was fully awake, meals were being prepared, charcoal stoves were lit, cooking fires burned in thousands of homes at the same time. Rice simmered, tea kettles steamed, small flames flickered inside wooden kitchens across the city. This was normal life. Tokyo wasn't a quiet city waiting for disaster. It was busy, crowded, alive. The streets were narrow. The buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, wood upon wood, paper walls, tiled roofs resting on timber frames. From above, it was a maze. From the inside, it felt familiar, safe, permanent. Then the ground moved, not gently, violently. The earth shook hard enough to throw people off their feet. Walls cracked, beams twisted, entire neighborhoods lurched at once. Cooking pots toppled, charcoal spilled, open flames were knocked free. Inside homes, fires were suddenly uncontrolled. Outside, people staggered into the streets, trying to stay upright as the city convulsed beneath them. The shaking lasted long enough to feel endless, and when it finally stopped, Tokyo looked wounded, but standing. Most buildings hadn't collapsed. Most streets were still there. To many, it felt like the city had survived. But what mattered most wasn't what fell. It was what stayed lit. Across Tokyo, thousands of small fires had just been born. Not one giant blaze, not a single explosion, but countless sparks, scattered across a city built almost entirely of fuel. Wooden houses, wooden shops, wooden alleys packed so tightly that sunlight barely reached the ground. Fire didn't need to search for something to burn. It was already surrounded. Tokyo at that time wasn't fragile. It was flexible, traditional, built to bend during earthquakes. And that design worked. The city didn't collapse, but it had another weakness, a far deadlier one. It burned easily. Every block was a matchbox, every street a fuse. The very features that allowed Tokyo to grow so dense, so efficient, so alive, also made it dangerously flammable. No one had planned for that moment, a moment when shaking would end, but fire would not. Fire didn't arrive later. It was already there, waiting, quietly spreading from kitchen to kitchen, from home to home. And while people focused on the damage they could see, cracked walls, fallen beams, broken streets, the real danger was growing behind them, unnoticed, because the shaking wasn't the real threat. It was what the shaking left behind. By the time the shaking stopped, the fires had already started. Not one fire, not 10, thousands, small, ordinary flames. The kind people dealt with every day, had suddenly escaped control at the exact same moment. Across Tokyo, cooking fires tipped over. Charcoal spilled, oil ignited, paper walls caught instantly. What would have been a minor house fire on any other day was now happening everywhere at once. And that changed everything. Firefighters didn't rush toward a single blaze. They faced a citywide ignition. Every street, every block, every neighborhood. Tokyo wasn't being attacked by fire. It was surrounded by it. The wind made it worse. Strong, dry winds swept through the narrow streets, feeding oxygen into the flames, pushing heat sideways instead of upward. Fire didn't rise and burn out. It traveled. It jumped from roof to roof, from house to house, from block to block. Sparks didn't fall harmlessly to the ground. They landed on dry wood, on paper walls, on rooftops stacked tightly together with no space in between. There were no fire breaks, no wide roads to stop the spread, no open squares large enough to slow it down, no empty buffers between neighborhoods. Tokyo had grown dense by design, efficient, compact, alive. But density has a cost. When fire enters a city like that, it doesn't need to search for fuel. It already has too much. And Tokyo in 1923 was almost entirely built from it. Wooden frames, wooden floors, wooden ceilings, paper walls stretched thin between rooms. Even the streets were narrow enough to trap heat, turning them into channels instead of escape routes. The city hadn't been built to resist fire. It had been built to survive earthquakes. And in that moment, those two goals collided. To understand how bad this was, Americans often think of familiar disasters: the Great Chicago Fire, San Francisco, 1906. Both cities burned. Both cities were changed forever. But Tokyo was worse. Chicago had open streets, San Francisco had stone buildings and wider roads. Tokyo had none of that. Its fires didn't spread across blocks. They consumed entire districts. And unlike those American disasters, Tokyo wasn't dealing with a single ignition point. It was fighting thousands, all at once. Fire crews couldn't reach many neighborhoods. Water lines were damaged. Equipment was limited. And there simply weren't enough people to fight that many fires simultaneously. Even if every firefighter in the city had worked perfectly, it wouldn't have been enough. Because this wasn't a firefighting problem. It was an urban design problem, a city problem, a system problem. The heat grew intense enough to change the air itself. Hot winds pulled flames forward, creating self-feeding currents. Fire didn't just spread, it began to organize. And that's when the nature of the disaster changed. Individual fires stopped behaving like separate events. They moved closer. They grew larger. They began to connect. Tokyo wasn't burning in pieces anymore. It was becoming something else, something far more dangerous. Because when enough fires exist close together, they don't stay independent. They merge. And once that happens, the city no longer controls the fire controls the city. And that's the moment Tokyo crossed a line it could never step back from. Because what came next was no longer a series of fires. It was a single unstoppable force, and it was just beginning to take shape. By late afternoon, the fires were no longer separate events. They had found each other. What began as thousands of individual blazes had merged into something far more dangerous: a firestorm. This wasn't just fire spreading across the city, it was fire creating its own weather. As entire districts burned at once, the heat rose violently into the sky. And when hot air rises, something else must rush in to replace it. Cold air, fast. The city itself began to inhale. Winds were pulled inward from every direction, not pushed by the weather, but dragged by the fire. The stronger the flames became, the stronger the winds grew. And the stronger the winds grew, the faster the fire spread. A closed loop, self-feeding, self-amplifying, unstoppable. People caught inside it didn't experience fire the way they expected. They weren't chased by a wall of flames from behind. They were surrounded. Heat came from every direction at once. The air itself became dangerous. Breathing burned the lungs. Oxygen disappeared. Each gasp delivered more heat instead of relief. Running didn't help. Wind forced people back toward the center. Streets became tunnels of flame. Every turn led to more heat. Some tried to escape into open areas. Parks, plazas, riverbanks, places that felt safe. They weren't. Firestorms don't respect open space. They consume it. In some parks, the temperature rose so high that the air ignited debris on the ground. People collapsed not from burns, but from suffocation, from heat so intense their bodies simply shut down. Bridges that should have offered escape became traps. Wind-driven flames cut across them sideways, turning exits into barriers. Roads melted into corridors of fire. There was no single direction to flee. Every path closed at once. This wasn't a city losing a battle. This was a city being erased. Firefighters could do nothing. No amount of water could cool the air. No tools could break the wind. No strategy could outrun a phenomenon that fed on itself. At this point, the fire wasn't something to fight. It was something to endure, if endurance were even possible. And for many, it wasn't. Most of the dead in Tokyo that day were not crushed by falling buildings. They weren't trapped under rubble. They died standing, or running, or gasping, overwhelmed by heat, starved of oxygen, victims of a force that turned an entire city into a furnace. This is the part of the disaster that's hardest to understand, because it didn't look like chaos. It looked like inevitability. No explosion, no single moment of impact, just a city surrounded by fire, with nowhere left to go. And once the firestorm formed, there was no way to stop it. Not with manpower, not with planning, not with courage. The system had already failed, and Tokyo was now at the mercy of something it had unknowingly created. Because when fire reaches this scale, the city no longer decides what happens next. The fire does, and Tokyo had no way to stop it. By the time the firestorm reached its peak, the disaster was no longer about individual choices. It was about systems, and every major system Tokyo depended on was already overwhelmed. The government didn't lose control all at once. It lost it in layers. Communication broke first. Phone lines were damaged. Messengers couldn't move through burning streets. Information traveled slower than the fire. Orders were delayed. Warnings never arrived. Coordination collapsed under heat, smoke, and confusion. Fire departments faced an impossible equation. They weren't fighting one fire. They were fighting thousands. Equipment was limited. Water pressure dropped as pipes cracked and pumps failed. Hoses that worked in normal conditions were useless against wind-driven walls of flame. Fire crews made decisions no one should ever have to make. Which neighborhoods to abandon, which streets could no longer be reached, which lives could not be saved. This wasn't incompetence, it was saturation. The system had reached a scale it was never designed for. Tokyo had emergency plans, but none of them imagined a citywide firestorm. The assumptions were smaller. Localized fires, containable damage, recoverable zones. What actually happened exceeded every model. Urban planning magnified the failure. The city's density, once a strength, became a liability. Narrow streets blocked movement. Closely packed buildings transferred heat instantly. There were no buffers to slow the spread. Parks and rivers had been treated as public spaces, not as emergency fire breaks. Roads were built for efficiency, not evacuation under extreme heat. The city worked perfectly, until it didn't. Risk had been underestimated. Earthquakes were expected. Fire was considered secondary. But in 1923, Tokyo, fire was the primary killer. The danger wasn't ignored, it was misjudged. No one believed thousands of small fires could become one unified force. No one planned for air itself becoming lethal. No one imagined a disaster that fed on the city's own design. Once those assumptions failed, there was nothing left to fall back on. This is the part of the story that matters beyond Tokyo, because this wasn't a uniquely Japanese mistake, it was a human one. Cities everywhere make the same trade-offs. Density versus safety, efficiency versus resilience, cost versus worst-case scenarios. Tokyo paid the price for assuming the worst couldn't happen all at once. By the end, entire districts were gone, not damaged, erased. Maps no longer matched reality. Neighborhoods existed only in memory. And yet, something survived. Not the systems that failed that day, but the lessons they left behind. Because while Tokyo was erased, it was not forgotten. And what rose from the ashes would change the city forever. When the fires finally burned themselves out, Tokyo was no longer the city it had been that morning. Entire districts were gone. Streets ended in ash. Familiar neighborhoods existed only in memory. But what followed was not surrender. It was reconstruction with intention. Tokyo did not rebuild itself the way it had been. It rebuilt itself the way it needed to be. The streets came first. Narrow alleys that once trapped heat and fire were widened. Not for beauty, not for traffic, but to create space. Space where fire could slow, space where people could move, space where a city could breathe. Then came open areas. Parks were no longer just places to relax. They became buffers, fire breaks, emergency gathering zones. Green space wasn't treated as decoration anymore. It became infrastructure. Building standards changed. Materials were reconsidered. Construction methods tightened. Codes evolved. Not to make buildings indestructible, but to make failure less catastrophic. Tokyo accepted a hard truth. Disasters don't have to be avoided perfectly. They have to be survived. What emerged wasn't just a rebuilt city, it was a new mindset. Japan began to plan differently, not for what was likely, but for what was possible. Worst-case scenarios became central, not optional. Earthquakes were assumed, fires were anticipated, failures were expected, and systems were designed with that expectation in mind. This thinking didn't fade with time. It hardened into culture. Disaster drills in schools, evacuation routes built into neighborhoods, public education that treated preparedness as a civic duty, not a personal hobby. The goal was never to eliminate risk. It was to live with it, eyes open. Modern Tokyo didn't emerge by accident. It was shaped by loss, by decisions made in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction. The city learned that resilience isn't about strength alone. It's about foresight, redundancy, humility, understanding that nature doesn't negotiate and that systems must be designed accordingly. Today, when people look at Tokyo, they see efficiency, technology, order. What they don't see is the memory embedded in its streets, the width of the roads, the placement of parks, the rules written into its buildings. All of it is a response, a conversation with the past. Modern Tokyo exists because the old one burned. The earthquake shook the city, fire changed it forever, and the lesson it left behind is one every city still has to learn.